Ryan Reynolds has spoken, and instead of quieting the situation, his comments have intensified scrutiny. Justin Baldoni remains at the center of a story that continues to grow, not because of new rulings, but because of how the narrative around him is being shaped. Blake Lively is now part of a media cycle where private communications, public reactions, and strategic messaging are colliding in real time. What's driving the escalation isn't a courtroom decision. It's the way this story is being managed, framed, and repeated. Over the past several days, unsealed text messages, selective reporting, and coordinated media outreach have created a narrative that feels increasingly settled in the public mind, even though many of the underlying details remain disputed or dependent on context. That has led to growing backlash, not only toward the people involved, but toward the process behind the coverage itself. Central to that process is Leslie Sloan, Blake Lively's publicist, whose role in media outreach, headline framing, and reporter communication has become a focal point of discussion. As coverage expands, even figures like Taylor Swift have been pulled into the conversation through secondary reporting, widening the scope and increasing speculation. This video isn't about deciding who's right or wrong. It's about examining how media narratives form, how PR pressure and access can influence coverage, and why repetition can harden public opinion before all the information is fully understood. So we're going to slow this down. We'll look at why the narrative appears to be getting worse rather than better, how media outlets and publicists factor into that shift, and why credibility and context matter when stories reach this scale. One of the most important things to understand about this situation is that the growing backlash surrounding Justin Baldoni, Blake Lively, and Ryan Reynolds is not being driven by new legal findings or judicial rulings. There has been no court decision that materially changes the legal landscape. There has been no ruling that resolves questions of liability, credibility, or responsibility. And yet, the public narrative continues to escalate. That escalation is happening almost entirely outside the courtroom, driven by media coverage, text messages, and repeated interpretations that are beginning to feel conclusive, even though many of the underlying details remain disputed or dependent on context. A clear turning point in this escalation came when Ryan Reynolds chose to publicly address the controversy and double down on his text messages. His comment that he wasn't angry enough became widely circulated, not because it introduced new evidence, but because it shifted the emotional framing of the story. For many observers, that moment mattered less for what it clarified and more for what it signaled. In high-profile situations like this, tone often shapes perception more than substance. When public statements come across as defensive or combative, they tend to invite further scrutiny rather than closure. Instead of narrowing the conversation, they widen it. That is often where narratives begin to harden. Once statements become headlines, they take on a life of their own. Media outlets react to one another, commentary builds on previous coverage, and soon the story becomes less about the original dispute and more about the ongoing reactions to it. Throughout this process, Justin Baldoni remains positioned as the central figure in the narrative, not because of newly tested allegations, but because earlier claims and interpretations are being repeatedly resurfaced. Each repetition reinforces familiarity, and familiarity can begin to feel like confirmation, even when no new verification has occurred. This is a key dynamic in media narratives. When the same framing appears across outlets such as People magazine, US Weekly, Page 6, or the Daily Mail, audiences may interpret consistency as certainty. But consistency of coverage does not necessarily equal evidentiary confirmation. It often reflects alignment in sourcing, access, or framing. At the same time, Blake Lively's role in the story has increasingly been viewed through the lens of media strategy rather than legal development. As unsealed text messages entered the public conversation, attention shifted away from their private context and toward how those messages were presented, excerpted, and circulated. For many viewers, the issue is not the existence of text messages themselves. It is the concern that context may be selectively applied. When private communications are released in fragments, interpretation fills in the gaps. And when those fragments are paired with strong headlines or repeated commentary, audiences may feel that the narrative is being shaped rather than discovered. That perception is where skepticism takes root. Skepticism then evolves into backlash, not necessarily because viewers believe wrongdoing has been proven, but because they sense an imbalance in how the story is being told. As the coverage continues, the focus begins to shift from individual statements to the process behind the coverage itself. Questions emerge about why certain interpretations are emphasized, why others receive less attention, and how media incentives influence which angles gain traction. This is where figures like Leslie Sloan, Blake Lively's publicist, begin to factor into the public conversation. Allegations and reporting around media outreach, headline framing, and reporter communication introduce another layer of scrutiny, not about legality, but about narrative construction. Once the mechanics of PR and media access enter the discussion, trust becomes a central issue. Audiences start to ask whether coverage reflects independent reporting or curated messaging. They question whether stories are being planted, shaped, or softened through relationships between publicists and outlets. And once those questions are raised, even accurate reporting can be viewed through a lens of suspicion. This dynamic creates a feedback loop. Attempts to clarify or defend messaging invite more analysis. More analysis leads to additional coverage. Additional coverage amplifies scrutiny rather than resolving it. Importantly, this escalation does not require a coordinated effort. It can occur organically when public figures respond in real time, while media ecosystems reward speed, access, and engagement. In that environment, restraint is often interpreted as absence, and presence is interpreted as escalation. As the story grows, collateral figures are pulled in, and the scope widens beyond the original dispute. Each expansion increases speculation, reduces context, and makes it harder for audiences to distinguish between allegation, interpretation, and established fact. The result is a narrative that feels increasingly charged, not because the factual record has dramatically changed, but because the way the story is being communicated has. And when communication outpaces verification, public confidence tends to rise faster than actual clarity. As the narrative around Justin Baldoni, Blake Lively, and Ryan Reynolds has intensified, attention has increasingly shifted away from individual statements and toward the mechanics of media coverage itself. This is where questions about PR pressure, media access, and headline framing begin to take center stage. Central to this part of the discussion is Leslie Sloan, Blake Lively's longtime publicist. Her role has come under scrutiny not because of a single action, but because of a broader pattern described in reporting and testimony, one that raises questions about how stories are shaped before they reach the public. According to the reporting, Leslie Sloan was allegedly involved in direct outreach to multiple media outlets, including People magazine, US Weekly, Page 6, The Daily Mail, New York Post, and Radar Online. The concern raised is not simply that a publicist communicated with reporters, that is standard industry practice, but how that communication may have influenced framing. The allegations focus on requests to adjust headlines, change descriptive language or adjectives, emphasize certain interpretations over others, and in some instances, preview stories before publication. If accurate, those actions would go beyond routine press coordination and enter the realm of narrative management. This distinction matters. Public relations is expected to advocate for clients. Journalism is expected to maintain editorial independence. When the line between those roles appears blurred, reader trust becomes fragile. As coverage continued, the perception that stories were being planted, softened, or steered through access relationships began to fuel skepticism. That skepticism did not arise from any single article, but from the cumulative effect of similar framing appearing across multiple outlets. Consistency can be persuasive, but it can also raise questions. When headlines across different publications echo the same language or emphasis, audiences naturally wonder whether that alignment reflects independent reporting or shared sourcing. This is especially true when the stories rely heavily on interpretation rather than newly verified facts. At that point, the media narrative does more than report events, it begins to define the public understanding of them. The scrutiny intensified further when Leslie Sloan's deposition testimony entered the conversation. In that context, repeated phrases such as "I don't recall" and "I felt like it" became focal points. While such language is not unusual in legal settings, its repetition can affect how credibility is perceived, especially when contrasted with the confidence expressed in media statements. This contrast highlights an important difference between legal standards and media standards. In depositions, precision matters. Memory gaps are acknowledged, certainty is restrained. In media narratives, confidence is often rewarded, even when details remain unresolved. When those two worlds collide, audiences may notice the inconsistency. That inconsistency doesn't automatically imply misconduct, but it does contribute to the sense that the public-facing narrative may be more polished than the sworn record supports. Once credibility becomes a talking point, the story shifts again from what happened to how reliably it's being described. Another layer of this discussion involves power dynamics, particularly when high-profile individuals and institutions are involved. Reporting suggests that Ryan Reynolds contacted entities such as Sony and WME, raising questions about influence behind the scenes. Whether those contacts were advisory, protective, or strategic, their existence feeds into a broader concern about how power operates in media ecosystems. When studios, agencies, or crisis consultants are perceived to be involved, audiences may infer that access and leverage are shaping which narratives gain traction. This perception is reinforced by the involvement of Melissa Nathan, a crisis management expert. Her presence introduces the idea that reputation strategy, rather than transparency, may be guiding responses. Again, the issue is not that crisis management exists, it does, and often appropriately. The issue is how its involvement is interpreted once it becomes visible. When audiences believe messaging is being engineered, trust erodes. As PR pressure, access, and credibility concerns converge, the media narrative enters a feedback loop. Stories prompt responses. Responses generate more stories. Each iteration adds interpretation, but not necessarily clarity. Outlets like TMZ, Puck, and The Hollywood Reporter amplify elements of the story further, expanding its reach and pulling additional figures into the conversation. Once that expansion begins, the narrative becomes increasingly difficult to contain or correct. Corrections rarely travel as far as initial claims. Context arrives late, if at all, and by the time nuance is introduced, public perception may already be set. This is how media narratives gain momentum, not through a single act of manipulation, but through overlapping incentives, access relationships, and the speed of modern coverage. As the media narrative expanded, one of the most emotionally charged elements introduced into the coverage was the allegation involving Blake Lively's driver. This allegation quickly became a focal point in certain headlines and commentary, not because it had been tested in court, but because of how it was framed and circulated publicly. According to reporting, the driver alleged that he overheard or was present for a disturbing conversation involving Justin Baldoni. Once this claim entered the media ecosystem, it was repeated across multiple outlets and quickly absorbed into the broader narrative surrounding the case. However, as with many elements of this story, the issue is not simply that an allegation exists. It's how that allegation was presented and what information was missing when it was amplified. One of the first questions raised by observers was context. Driver testimony, by its nature, is secondhand. It depends on timing, proximity, interpretation, and memory. Without corroboration, supporting evidence, or a clear record of circumstances, such statements require careful handling, particularly when they are introduced into a public narrative rather than evaluated through a legal process. In this case, key contextual details were either unclear or absent from early coverage. When exactly the alleged conversation occurred, who else was present, whether the driver's account was documented contemporaneously, and whether the allegation was ever raised through formal channels before becoming public. These gaps matter. When allegations are presented without sufficient context, audiences are left to fill in the blanks themselves, and in high-profile situations, those assumptions often skew toward the most serious interpretation. That is how reputational damage accelerates. A recurring theme in reporting is the distinction between allegation and evidence, a line that can blur quickly once media narratives take hold. An allegation, even when sincerely believed, is not the same as verified fact. Evidence requires corroboration, documentation, and the opportunity for challenge. When allegations bypass those steps and are introduced directly into the public sphere, they can take on a disproportionate weight. This is especially true when the individual at the center of the allegation, in this case Justin Baldoni, is already positioned as a central figure in a contested narrative. Once an accusation aligns with an existing frame, it is more readily accepted, repeated, and amplified. That doesn't mean the allegation is false, but it does mean the process of evaluation has been skipped, and that omission is precisely what fuels skepticism. Another point emphasized is timing. Questions have been raised about when the driver's allegation was disclosed and why it surfaced publicly at the particular moment it did. Timing can influence perception significantly. An allegation introduced during heightened media attention may be interpreted differently than one raised contemporaneously with the events in question. When disclosures occur after narratives have already formed, audiences may question motivation, even if none exists. This is not about accusing anyone of bad faith. It's about recognizing how timing shapes interpretation. In media environments where attention cycles move quickly, the order in which information is released can be as influential as the information itself. As the driver allegation circulated, it was often presented in isolation, detached from broader context or competing perspectives. Selective reporting can unintentionally exaggerate the importance of a single claim. When outlets focus heavily on one allegation without equally emphasizing uncertainty, corroboration, or response, audiences may perceive the claim as more definitive than it is. This contributes to what reporting repeatedly highlights: media certainty outpacing verification. Once that certainty takes hold, corrections or clarifications struggle to gain the same traction. The initial impression lingers, even as details remain unresolved. That dynamic is not unique to this case. It is a structural feature of modern media. In situations involving reputational harm, context is not a luxury, it is a necessity. Context allows audiences to understand the limits of a claim, the conditions under which it was made, and how much weight it should reasonably carry. Without context, even minor allegations can assume outsized significance. This is why reporters places such emphasis on questioning not just what is being reported, but how and why it's being reported in that manner. When stories rely heavily on implication rather than substantiation, they invite skepticism, not only toward the individuals involved, but toward the media outlets amplifying them. As the driver allegation became part of the public narrative, it contributed to a widening gap between public perception and established fact. Each repetition reinforced a sense of inevitability. Each headline added emotional weight, and each omission of context made the story harder to reassess. This is how narratives harden, not through a single definitive revelation, but through cumulative framing that gradually removes ambiguity. And once ambiguity disappears, audiences often assume certainty, even when the underlying questions remain unresolved. As scrutiny around media coverage and credibility intensified, another dimension of this story began drawing attention: power dynamics. Specifically, questions emerged about how influence operates when high-profile individuals, major studios, and powerful agencies intersect with an already volatile media narrative. Central to this discussion is Ryan Reynolds. According to reporting, Reynolds did not limit his involvement to public statements or text messages. Instead, claims surfaced that he contacted Sony and WME, raising concerns about behind-the-scenes pressure during an already sensitive situation. The issue is not whether those communications occurred, nor is it about assigning motive. The issue is how power is perceived once those contacts become part of the public conversation. When a figure with significant industry influence engages directly with studios or agencies during a dispute, it alters how audiences interpret the balance of power. Even neutral or protective outreach can be perceived as leverage when viewed through the lens of reputation management. Perception matters, especially in media narratives. It's important to distinguish between influence and intent. Influence exists regardless of how it's used. A public figure with established relationships, box office credibility, and institutional access naturally carries weight. When that influence enters a contested narrative, audiences may assume pressure even when none is explicitly stated. This is particularly true when agencies like WME or studios like Sony are involved, because they represent not just individual interests, but entire production ecosystems. Once those entities appear connected to a dispute, the narrative shifts from individual behavior to systemic power. That shift changes everything. Another layer of complexity involves disputes over creative control, particularly claims related to final edit on It Ends With Us. Creative control disputes are not uncommon in Hollywood, but when they become entangled with allegations, PR strategy, and media framing, they take on a different significance. According to reporting, claims surrounding who held final edit authority became part of the broader narrative, only to later disappear or be modified in amended complaints. That evolution raised questions. When allegations change over time, audiences naturally ask why. Was the claim overstated? Was it misunderstood? Or did additional information alter the framing? Again, the issue is not about drawing conclusions, it's about process transparency. When public narratives present assertions that later shift or vanish without explanation, trust erodes. Once power imbalance enters the conversation, it becomes a narrative driver in its own right. Stories framed around imbalance resonate strongly with audiences, particularly in entertainment contexts where gatekeeping and access have long been subjects of criticism. When Justin Baldoni is positioned opposite figures with greater institutional reach, audiences may interpret silence as weakness and speech as resistance, even when legal strategy advises restraint. This creates a difficult dynamic. Those with less access are often encouraged to speak up, while those with more access are expected to manage optics carefully. Any deviation from those expectations becomes fodder for interpretation, and interpretation, once amplified, becomes narrative. This is where crisis management enters the picture. The involvement of Melissa Nathan, a well-known crisis management consultant, further shaped public perception. Her presence introduced the idea that messaging was being strategically engineered rather than organically expressed. Crisis management is not inherently negative. It exists to prevent miscommunication and mitigate harm. But once its involvement becomes visible, audiences may assume orchestration, particularly when coverage appears polished or synchronized. This assumption compounds skepticism. When messaging is perceived as managed, even accurate statements can be questioned. Audiences begin to ask whether they are hearing truth, strategy, or a blend of both. Another consequence of studio involvement is silence. Large institutions often avoid public commentary during disputes, preferring to wait for resolution, but silence itself becomes meaningful in media narratives. When Sony or WME do not publicly address claims, speculation fills the gap. Commentators interpret absence as alignment, distancing, or quiet endorsement, even when none is intended. This is how institutional silence can unintentionally shape narratives. As power dynamics become more visible, media coverage often shifts focus. Rather than examining specific facts, coverage begins emphasizing who has access, who has influence, who can speak freely, and who cannot. This framing reinforces the idea that outcomes are determined not by evidence, but by leverage. Whether or not that perception reflects reality, its impact is real. Once audiences believe power is shaping the story, trust diminishes, not only in individuals, but in systems that support them. Power dynamics don't determine truth, but they do shape how stories are received. When studios, agencies, publicists, and crisis consultants appear connected to a narrative, audiences may assume coordination even when actions are independent. This is why transparency and restraint matter so much in high-profile disputes. Without them, perception can overshadow process. And once perception takes hold, it becomes difficult to unwind, regardless of how the facts ultimately settle. As questions around power dynamics and media access continue to surface, attention increasingly turned toward crisis management and reputation strategy, not as abstract concepts, but as active forces shaping how this story has unfolded publicly. Central to this discussion is Melissa Nathan, a crisis management consultant whose involvement became part of the narrative itself. The significance of her presence is not rooted in wrongdoing. Crisis management exists precisely because high-profile situations can spiral quickly, and professional guidance is often sought to prevent misinformation, miscommunication, or unnecessary damage. However, once crisis management becomes visible to the public, it changes how messaging is perceived. Instead of being viewed as organic responses, statements and media engagement may be interpreted as strategic positioning. That perception alone can alter audience trust, regardless of whether the messaging is accurate. In this case, reporting emphasizes that the narrative shifted once crisis strategy appeared to be part of the equation. Viewers and readers began to question not just what was being said, but why it was being said in that particular way. One of the tensions highlighted in this phase of the story is the balance between reputation protection and transparency. Reputation strategy often prioritizes consistency, clarity, and control. Transparency, on the other hand, can involve uncertainty, nuance, and incomplete answers. When a situation is already emotionally charged, those two approaches can come into conflict. Audiences tend to be skeptical of messaging that feels overly polished during moments of controversy. They may interpret clarity as choreography rather than sincerity, even when the underlying information is truthful. This skepticism does not require proof of manipulation. It arises from perception. Once that perception sets in, even small inconsistencies can attract disproportionate attention. Another major factor in this phase of the narrative is the exposure of text messages, particularly those accessed through Jennifer Abel's phone. Text messages occupy a unique space in public controversies. They feel intimate and immediate, yet they are inherently fragmentary. Without full context, tone, or surrounding conversation, they invite interpretation. Reporters' coverage raises questions about how those texts were obtained, how they were selected, and how they were presented to media outlets. The concern is not merely about privacy, but about selective exposure. When some messages are released and others remain unseen, audiences may wonder whether the selection process itself is shaping the narrative. This concern becomes more pronounced when texts appear aligned with a particular framing or storyline. The involvement of Stephanie Jones further complicates the picture. As a former representative whose role became part of the unfolding narrative, her position highlights the internal dynamics that can influence what information becomes public and when. When internal disputes intersect with external media coverage, lines between professional disagreement and narrative leverage can blur. This is not unique to this case. It is a recurring pattern in high-profile conflicts. When internal relationships deteriorate, communication often fragments. Information is released unevenly, context is lost, and once fragments enter the media ecosystem, they are rarely reassembled in their original form. As crisis management, text exposure, and internal dynamics converged, the media narrative continued to evolve. Outlets and commentators began interpreting not just events, but strategy. Was messaging reactive or proactive? Was silence deliberate or forced? Were disclosures defensive or corrective? These questions, while understandable, often lack definitive answers, yet they shape coverage nonetheless. Once media outlets begin framing actions as strategic, audiences are encouraged to view every move through a tactical lens. Even neutral behavior can be recast as calculated. This framing intensifies scrutiny rather than resolving uncertainty. One of the risks of visible crisis management is that it can unintentionally reinforce the idea that narratives are being controlled. When audiences believe messaging is engineered, they may discount it, not because it is false, but because they question its independence. This creates a paradox. The very tools designed to protect reputation can, under certain conditions, undermine credibility if their presence becomes too apparent. This phase of the story matters because it shifts the focus away from individual claims and toward process integrity. Audiences are no longer asking only whether allegations are true. They are asking whether the story they are receiving reflects the full picture or a curated version of it. Once that question arises, trust becomes fragile. And when trust erodes, narratives tend to accelerate rather than stabilize. What emerges from this stage is not a clear answer, but a pattern. Crisis management, text exposure, and internal disputes do not operate in isolation. Together, they shape how stories are interpreted, amplified, and remembered. In this environment, restraint and transparency become increasingly difficult, yet increasingly necessary. Because once audiences believe perception is being managed, every new detail is filtered through suspicion, and suspicion, once established, is hard to reverse. As the story continued to circulate, it began to move beyond the original dispute and into a broader media ecosystem, one driven by amplification, repetition, and the incentives of modern coverage. This is the phase where narratives stop belonging to any single party and begin taking on a life of their own. Outlets such as TMZ, Puck, The Hollywood Reporter, Page Six, and the Daily Mail played a role in expanding the reach of the story. Each platform approached the situation from a slightly different angle, but together they contributed to a cumulative effect: constant visibility. Once a story reaches this level of saturation, it becomes increasingly difficult for audiences to track what is new, what is repeated, and what is speculative. Repetition blurs those distinctions. As amplification increased, the scope of the story widened. What began as a dispute involving Justin Baldoni, Blake Lively, and Ryan Reynolds expanded to include secondary figures and peripheral narratives. Each addition added complexity, but also diluted context. This is where collateral damage emerges. Individuals who are not central to the dispute may find themselves drawn into coverage simply because of association, past communication, or public interest. Once included, they become part of the narrative, whether or not their involvement is legally or substantively relevant. A clear example of this expansion is the inclusion of Taylor Swift in media coverage. Her involvement, as described in Kiersey's reporting, was not tied to legal claims or direct allegations. Instead, it stemmed from the exposure of text messages and the way secondary reporting framed her proximity to the situation. Once Taylor Swift's name entered the conversation, the narrative gained additional gravity. Her presence attracts attention, her name increases reach, and her inclusion broadens the audience far beyond those following the original dispute. This shift illustrates how narratives grow once they intersect with figures of significant cultural visibility. Importantly, this expansion can occur without intention. Media outlets often reference recognizable names to provide context or relevance, but the effect is the same. The story becomes larger, louder, and harder to contain. As narratives expand, precision often suffers. Details become compressed, timelines blur, and nuance is replaced by shorthand. This is especially evident when coverage relies on excerpts rather than full context. Quotes are shortened, text messages are isolated, and readers are left to infer meaning from fragments. Once fragmentation sets in, correction becomes difficult. Later clarifications may not reach the same audience as initial reports. Follow-ups receive less attention, and the original framing continues to shape perception long after its limitations are acknowledged. Another factor in this phase is editorial incentive. Outlets operate within attention-driven systems. Stories that generate engagement are more likely to be revisited. Updates may emphasize reaction rather than resolution, because reaction sustains interest. This does not require bad faith. It reflects how media ecosystems function. When a story involves high-profile names, allegations, and emotional stakes, it naturally attracts sustained coverage. Each new angle, even a minor one, becomes an opportunity to reframe the narrative. Over time, the accumulation of angles can overwhelm the original facts. As amplification continues, a gap often emerges between public perception and formal process. Legal proceedings move slowly. Media narratives move quickly. By the time procedural developments occur, public opinion may already be settled. At that point, even definitive information struggles to reset understanding. This is one of the central tensions highlighted in Kiersey's analysis. Media certainty frequently arrives before verification. Once that certainty takes hold, audiences may resist complexity. They prefer coherent stories over ambiguous ones, and ambiguity is inherent in unresolved disputes. At this stage, de-escalation becomes challenging. Silence can be interpreted as avoidance. Statements can be reframed as strategy. Clarifications may be dismissed as spin. This creates a no-win scenario for those involved. Meanwhile, the media ecosystem continues to reward momentum, making restraint less visible than reaction. Collateral damage is not limited to reputations. It affects trust in media institutions, confidence in reporting standards, and the public's ability to distinguish between allegation, interpretation, and established fact. When stories expand rapidly and widely, they test the limits of responsible coverage. And once those limits are strained, skepticism spreads, not just towards individuals, but toward the systems delivering the story. What becomes apparent at this stage is a broader pattern. Narratives do not simply report events. They evolve through amplification, association, and repetition. As more voices enter the conversation, clarity becomes harder to maintain. And when clarity fades, perception fills the gap. When you step back and look at this situation in full, one pattern becomes difficult to ignore. The story involving Justin Baldoni, Blake Lively, Ryan Reynolds, and the surrounding media ecosystem has not escalated because of decisive legal outcomes or newly established facts. It has escalated because of how information has moved, how it has been framed, and how quickly interpretation has replaced verification. Across each stage, from unsealed text messages to PR pressure to deposition testimony to allegations introduced without full context to studio involvement, crisis management, and finally widespread media amplification, the same tension keeps resurfacing. Public certainty is arriving faster than confirmed understanding. That gap matters. Legal processes are slow by design. They rely on corroboration, documentation, and standards of proof that do not bend to public reaction. Media narratives, by contrast, are shaped by immediacy, access, and repetition. When those two systems operate simultaneously, friction is inevitable. This is not a story about one headline, one text, or one interview. It is a story about process. It's about how repetition can harden perception, how selective framing can feel definitive, and how amplification can transform unresolved questions into assumed conclusions. Throughout this coverage, figures like Leslie Sloan, Melissa Nathan, Stephanie Jones, and Jennifer Abel became part of the narrative not because of court rulings, but because of how their roles were interpreted within a media context. Their presence shifted attention away from facts being tested and toward strategies being inferred. Similarly, the expansion of the story to include figures like Taylor Swift illustrates how narrative gravity works. Once a story intersects with cultural visibility, it grows beyond its original boundaries. Context thins, attention widens, and the line between relevance and association becomes blurred. None of this requires bad faith. It emerges naturally in environments where attention is currency and speed is rewarded. But the consequences are real. Reputations are shaped long before outcomes are determined. Corrections travel slower than claims, and nuance struggles to survive inside cycles built for momentum. What analysis consistently highlights is not the certainty of wrongdoing, but the fragility of credibility once narratives take hold without sufficient context. The more stories repeat without resolution, the harder it becomes for audiences to separate allegation from evidence, interpretation from fact. That doesn't mean questions shouldn't be asked. It means they should be asked carefully. As this situation continues, additional information may emerge, depositions may be clarified, legal proceedings may narrow or expand the scope of what actually matters, but none of that can happen meaningfully if conclusions are already locked in by repetition alone. The most responsible position at this stage is restraint, not silence, not dismissal, but patience. Because when narratives outpace verification, the risk is not just misunderstanding one story, it's normalizing a process where perception replaces proof. And once that becomes standard, everyone loses.